and also the people that skip breakfast, they tend to have a shorter lifespan and more diseases.
For you, longevity has been something you've been into, well, at least had a fascination with for a long time. This goes all the way back to your teens. So let's talk about that origin story. What got you fascinated in this topic at such a young age?
I'm not sure what got me there, but I was maybe 19 and studying in Texas, studying jazz, actually jazz performance, and I when I had the opportunity to get into the aging field because of some issues with the program back in the jazz performance department, I immediately thought I had to study aging, and then I switched to biochemistry because of I thought biology plus chemistry I can't go wrong, so it must be a good combination of disciplines, and it was probably a very good pick.
And what was that transition like for you, coming from a music background, being part of the arts, and then getting into the hardcore sciences, jumping right into biochemistry? Was that was that your first entry into the sciences, and how did that go?
Yes, my first entry, and I remember the chair of the department. He said he started laughing, and when he realized I never took a biology course, because biochemistry had lots of physical chemistry and lots of calculus and things that were pretty harsh. And so he thought maybe I'll last a couple months. That's what he said. And I ended up actually working in his laboratory. His name was Scott Norton, and then I stayed. Of course, I continued in biochemistry for many years until now. Yeah.
So let's go a little bit further back into your story. You were born and raised in Italy, northwestern Italy, and it was age 16 that you came to the US. And you mentioned the music, and your goal at that time was to become a rock star at 16. So you moved in with an aunt of yours in Chicago.
Yeah.
Talk about what that transition was like.
I mean, obviously, it was for me 16. Coming from Italy to Chicago, being a guitar player to me it was remarkable. So I very early on I got to study with some great teachers. One of them, a local famous bebop guitar player, whose name was Stuart Pierce. And then I started playing actually when I was maybe 17. I used to go down to Chicago Rush Street and just plug in and play. And so it was just a great time for me. And I wasn't even thinking about anything but rock and roll actually. So I was planning to be a rock guitar player, and that's all I was worrying about back then.
And then before you got to university, another pivotal moment in your story was joining the Army Reserve. And you did this for a couple years. So talk about what that was like and what you took from that experience.
Yeah, so I had definitely the art background, which I think is very very important for science and probably for medicine. And but I was very undisciplined, so I just joined the reserve, the Army Reserve, because I thought, well, I could get to go to school, I get to spend a weekend doing training, and it wasn't like that at all, right? We trained it in Fort Knox with the Marines for about 6 months, and it was tough, right? I didn't realize how tough it would be, and I stayed in there for 6 years actually in the reserves while I completed my university until I started at UCLA, my PhD at UCLA. And there's one thing in my life I talk about the most. It's just remarkable, right? I'm a pacifist, and never thought about any military service whatsoever. And that's the one. If I had to pick one thing that just transformed my life, it was the U.S. Army, and especially that training. We train with the Marines in Fort Knox, and so yeah, so that made me just another person.
And if you had to summarize it down, I'm sure there's a lot of different ways that changed you as a person. But what was the most central theme when you look at your life today that was transformed by the army experience?
Just the ability, the discipline, right? The ability to go for, we would go for 22 hours a day, sleep standing up, right? And it just crazy abuse, if you will, but all done in the same. I mean, all done by professionals that let you know that they were doing it for you. They didn't care. Right? They were not there to make us suffer. They were there to prepare us, right? And so the beauty of it, I think, is that one, you get into something that you don't understand, and by the time you understand it, it's too late, and so you have to just raise to that level, and just the ability to stand just this continuous, very difficult, extremely difficult situation. So when you get into science, then everything else seems fairly easy compared to, having to not sleep for weeks and weeks, and just take continuous physical and mental abuse.
And were you fairly healthy as a kid? By the time you got to the army, were you would you consider yourself pretty healthy?
Yeah, I was very healthy.
And then what kind of physical transformation took
Yeah, keep
place
in
during
mind
that
that
6
I was
years?
a soccer player. Yeah, so I play sports, not professionally, but close to it. So I felt I was very fit and trained, and I also felt, I wasn't spoiled at all, but um, big, big difference, from the time I get in to the time I get out. Especially the first couple of years, I think there was. The most important. So I mean, just leadership, the ability, eventually you run labs and companies, and lots of things, and I don't think I could do half of it if it wasn't for that kind of training.
Let's talk about your transition from undergrad in biochemistry into your PhD. When did you decide what kind of nuanced research you wanted to get into?
No, I had no doubt about the nuance. I was aging, so I studied with Robert Gracie at the University of North Texas. He was a very good scientist working on aging, and spent a couple of years working with him, for him. And then, it was just pretty obvious that for both music and for aging, Los Angeles was the place to go. And there was two people that I was interested in, and one was Roy Walford at UCLA. He was a pathologist at UCLA, very famous for his work on nutrition and longevity. And the other one was Caleb Finch at USC, very famous for his work on neurobiology of aging and inflammation. And so I ended up, working for Walford first, and then for my PhD, and then going over to Finch for my postdoc in neurobiology of aging and Alzheimer's disease.
And then where along the journey did you take a fascination and deep dive into fasting and its effects on human health?
That happened very soon because with Walford, this is the very start of my PhD. Walford was, of course, very famous for calorie restriction. So in Walford, I spent a couple of years in the Walford lab, and everything was about calorie restriction. And in fact, Walford, when I joined his lab, was doing his own human calorie restriction study in this place in Arizona called Biosphere 2. Right? So I actually met Wall for the first time through a window because he was sealed in this Biosphere 2 environment, a sealed environment in Arizona. And yeah, so that was my first experience with color restriction. And then when I went over to the biochemistry, I went back to the biochemistry department because I felt in the pathology department I was just getting lost with all this comparison: a young mouse, an old mouse, a restricted mouse, and unrestricted mouse. I felt that we needed to know the genes. What are the genes? What are the mechanisms that control aging? And then I could go back. So with Steve Clark, first I started working with bacteria that were starving, so stationary phase bacteria, And then with John Valentine and Edie Gralla, I started working with starving yeast. So microorganisms that were starving, and so I started sort of putting it all together: the Walford years and the starving bacteria, the starving yeast, and they were all living longer. And so that's where I started appreciating it wasn't just about restriction of calories. It was the starvation was part of the history of all organisms, and all organisms, or let's say the great majority of them, have this ability to exit the sort of the fast lane and then get into a starvation response mode, and stay there in a very protected, sort of shielded mode. And yeah, so that was it. And then of course I started the genetics of that. So why do they live longer under these conditions? What are the genes that are responsible for this? And that was the next maybe 6 or 7 years.
So, in the early days, when you guys are in the lab studying yeast, bacteria, and starving them, what did people think of that research at the time?
Well, first of all, surprisingly, for modern time, everybody thought that aging was a joke, right? So everybody thought research on aging. Why would you possibly? I remember UCLA, when somebody asks you, you say, "I work on free radical chemistry," right? So that was the answer. We were embarrassed to say I'm working on aging, and a very different world now, right? So 30 years, it completely changed the world in that sense. But that was 30 years ago, and then starvation made things even worse. And if you're already making fun of me for aging, then the aging people were making fun of me for working on starvation. So I just thought this is the greatest thing, right? And everybody thought this is the most boring thing that you can think of. You're starving organisms. Why are you doing that? Why don't you focus on much more interesting when they grow and what the growth genes are? Because back then, that was the Nobel prizes were given for growth genes, like the RAS genes and all of that. So the excitement was about growth, and it was about signal transduction and all of that. And so starvation was something that anybody found interesting. Even the yeast people, they thought it was the worst possible topic in yeast by genetics and biology was to work on starving yeast, right? There was a Nobel Prize at one time got on a podium in Paris, and he said, we do not work on yeast, because somebody asked a question. It was not even allowed to ask a question about starvation because it was so bad that you shouldn't even ask questions about this. And so he said, we do not work on starving organisms. You say, forget it, stop it.
So, let's talk about the evolution from there. You're working with the bacteria, the yeast, you're starving them in the lab. People aren't accepting at all of this at the time. What did you pivot into next? How did it evolve? And when did you really know you guys were onto something?
So first of all, I there was something called the replicative lifespan of yeast, and I thought, I don't like this. I don't think it's a good way to study aging. So I came up with the chronological lifespan of yeast, right? So which was really as yeast that was kept under starvation condition, and it couldn't divide, and it had to survive as long as possible under those conditions. But of course, it stores nutrients. So that was part of the life history, the program that yeast understand. And so then the obvious thing was, what are the genes that control all this? Are there mutations that can make a yeast live longer or shorter? And so then I spent 4 years, great years, with John Valentine, Edie Gralla, and also some of the people around us, with Fuyu Tamano, some of the greats of molecular biology of yeast, and that were around my department. And which, by the way, I think it had two Nobel prizes, in my department, and then one that was working on Louis Ignardo on nitric oxide across the street. So it was just really a remarkable environment back then at UCLA. So then we're looking for the genes, and eventually we found the genes. And the beauty of yeast, we were working on everything new, like starvation, stationary phase, yeast, chronological lifespan, all these things that nobody even knew what they meant, right? We had to come up with words. I came up with the chronological lifespan of yeast. And so then we were doing the screens and genetic screens, and there was the beauty of yeast, because we could say, I'm gonna throw free radicals at this organism, and I'm gonna just have lots of toxins, and let's figure out which gene protects them the most against all kinds of things that we can throw at them. And sure enough, there's one gene that kept coming up and up and up. And there was something called transposon mutagenesis, which we could use, which would just mutagenize all the yeast genes, about 6,000 of them. And then you could just, without knowing, ask the question, yeah, you tell me which one is the most important of all. And so TOR, cis kinase genes were kept coming up, and especially cis kinase, which in yeast is called SCH9. And so then, we send papers to the biggest journal. I remember Sal, they always review the papers. They thought it was very interesting, but but the people that reviewed it always blocked it, right? So for years I got these papers blocked and blocked and blocked. And then eventually, in 2001, I think I published a paper, a big paper, in my view, in Science, right? Science magazine, describing these mutations, and now we thought they were so central for aging in many organisms, not just yeast, and we turned out to be right. Yeah.
So let's talk about the next step from there. You do these tests, you find out the genes that are beneficial when it comes to aging. How do you take that knowledge and extrapolate it out into helping humans live longer?
At the time you don't, right? So at the time you just focus on, we just focused on understanding. I think you have to develop and build a certain, high level of understanding before you can begin to apply. I think that the begin to apply came around maybe at around 2004, 2005, when I started thinking about, we are sure that the proto-oncogenes, the genes that when mutated become oncogenes and are central for cancer. We realized that these proto-oncogenes were controlling the protection that I was talking about before in yeast. So what did that mean? That meant that if a proto-oncogene blocks the protection, then an oncogene and a cancer cell, by definition, will never be able to become protected when starved, right? So you starve yeast, that's what we knew, and then the yeast turns down these proto-oncogenes and it becomes protected. But if the proto-oncogenes are not turned off, so it turns off and it becomes protected. If the proto-oncogenes are not turned off, then there is no protection. So that's when I started thinking, does this mean that no matter what cancer cell it is, it will never become protected during starvation conditions? And I started thinking it has to be, right? It has to be, because it's just a fundamental property of cancer cells. So that means that all normal cells, no matter what organism they're from, they're gonna become protected. All cancer cells, no matter what the organism is, they're going to just keep on going. And that's what I first came up with, the concept of differential stress resistance. And then then I started applying it. Then I started trying to translate, saying, what about yeast? And the first experiment was with yeast, and then mice, and then of course the human clinical trials.
So what I'm hearing you say, and where this becomes really interesting, is the fact that when you starve these yeasts, the healthy cells become protected, cancer cells are still vulnerable. And you talk about this in your book. This is where you could use fasting, aka starvation, with a human being to protect the healthy cells and then expose those cancer cells and apply chemotherapy at that same time. So you call it a shield in the book. It's a really good analogy. You're basically shielding the healthy cells through fasting and then allowing the chemotherapy to go in, and all the cancer cells are exposed at that time. So you're protected and you're also leaving the cancer to take the brunt of the onslaught.
Yeah, and it gets worse, right? Much worse for the cancer cells than that, right? Because that was differential stress resistance. Then we started thinking, wait a minute, most mutations are deleterious based on the evolutionary biology theories. So if cancer's got a lot of mutations, couldn't it be that in fact now they're much weaker. They're not just not protected; they're not now much weaker than than a normal cell. And so we started looking at, is it possible that when you starve the mouse and then eventually people, the cancer cells become much weaker? And why would that be? Well, if you think about this constant need for nutrients, right? So the cancer cell, it just constantly needs lots of things, not everything, but lots of things. And also the interesting thing, if we think about evolutionary biology, the cancer cell has evolved in excess nutrients, right? Lots of amino acids, lots of sugars, lots of growth factors. So all of a sudden, all of that goes away and the chemotherapy comes in, right? So we started testing the hypothesis that we're going to make it much worse for a cancer cell under this condition. Not just they don't become protected, but they become sensitized. Yeah, and that was the concept of differential stress sensitization, DSS. And sure enough, it worked extremely well to the point that we have now lots of, and then eventually others also show the same, lots of different cancer model, and you can get mice that are, no matter what metastasis they have, then they end up being completely cancer free. So I think that this is very powerful at the fundamental level, but now we have the data from lots of different studies backing it up, at least in mice, and now we're starting to have the data from human trials.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you talk about in the book another aspect of this starvation or fasting is that the human immune system gets ramped up too. So it can better fight against the cancer. The human can actually fight better against cancer themselves.
Yes, so the immune systems in mice for sure is getting activated, and the hematopoietic stem cells give rise to more white blood cells, more T cells, etc. But the interesting thing seems to be tumor centered, meaning that the tumor seems to become much more visible to the immune cells than the immune cells being much more aggressive. So both happen, but they seem to happen mostly because the starvation does lots of things to the tumor, which then is more easily or much more easily recognizable by the T cells and other immune cells.
And has there been a lot of research done at this point of doing something very similar, but not using the chemotherapy? Doing a fast or a starvation and then allowing the body to ramp up its immune system and directly fight the cancer that way.
Yes, so of course we've done lots of work in mice, and there's only one place where you kind of see that working, and that's certain blood cancers, right? With the fasting alone. We've never seen it with any other cancer, especially solid tumors. So if you just use the fasting or the fasting mimicking diets, the tumor, it's about as good as a chemotherapy cycle. Each cycle of FMD or fasting is as good as a chemotherapy cycle, but the tumor grows, and eventually it gets to the same point as without anything. Yeah, no, we see the big difference when we combine. Um, so I always use the analogy of, let's say, I always say, imagine you take 2 billion people and you take 1 billion and you put them in the desert, in the Sahara Desert, and take 1 billion and you give them shade, you give them water, and you let them rest, right? You let them rest. And then you take another billion people and you make them run, you take the water away, and you take the shade away, right? So is you see the differential properties, but the sun, which is the chemotherapy or the radiotherapy or the immunotherapy, if you remove the sun and you just take the water away and you make them run, you can see out of a billion people, after a couple of weeks, lots of them will probably still be alive, right? But if you introduce the sun, then most people will say, I don't think anybody's going to survive 2 weeks of that. it's almost impossible. Yeah, so that's what we're trying to generate. What we're generating is like almost an impossible situation for the cancer cells. And the beauty is differential, right? So you just keep on going after it until every single one of them is dead, because of course they can't stop running, and if they can't stop running, they're not going to survive.
You mentioned there the susceptibility of cancer cells when it's blood cancer to just the fasting. I'm curious when it comes to the 1-2 punch of using chemotherapy and fasting together, with the data you've looked at and the research you've done, has there been any cancers that can outwit that? Or when it comes to using both of them together, does it usually have a significant effect?
No, no, we see a few cancers that are with that, but the fight that we're now, so our latest paper, we're getting smarter and smarter. We're not even using chemotherapy anymore, right? So the last couple of papers, we use hormone therapy and we use vitamin C. So in a last year papers, Myra and the lab use vitamin C, high dose injectable vitamin C, and that fasting mimicking diet together, and they were extremely toxic to KRAS mutated cells, which are about 25% of all cancers. So yeah, so that's a beauty of understanding molecular mechanism, and now we're also going into the cell and learning how does the cell rewire when you give them something. So we're going after, forget the chemo, let's go and radio, forget things that are toxic, and let's just focus on the non-toxic intervention. But B, also, what is it, how are few cells or many cells surviving that combination of fasting mimicking diet plus various drugs, right? And yeah, so we're getting very close to very soon being able to say, I know exactly, you're desperate, and I know exactly what you're doing to survive. And normally, if you have excess nutrients, there's many ways that the cancer, or the cancer is many cancers, right? So you have a mass, but in that mass is many different cancers. And so if you have excess nutrients, there is many, maybe potentially thousands of ways that one of these cancer cells within the cancer can figure out how to escape. And but if you starve them, now we're showing that this makes it a lot less. And now you have an opportunity to intervene. And so yeah, so I think that the new generation, like last year, we use hormone therapy and something called palbociclib, which is used for women that have breast cancer. And now you see when you add the fasting mimicking diet, all of a sudden these two drugs, which eventually result in resistance acquisition, so the cancer acquires resistance. This, of course, is in mice. Um, if you add the fasting mimicking diet, then you see, instead of acquisition resistance, you see the opposite, the tumor regression. The tumor keeps going down until it starts disappearing from the mice, right? So that's why we think of it as a wild card, a wild card effect, right? Because just helping all these different drugs work much better, and also help all these different drugs prevent the escape of some of the cells within the tumor that figured out how to defend themselves.
I think it's important, Walter, before we move forward, to define what you're referring to when you say the fasting mimicking diet.
Yeah, so fasting mimicking diet. Um, Many years ago, we started a clinical trial at USC on water only fasting and chemotherapy, and we realized that the patient did not want to do that, and the oncologist did not want them to do that. And so we went to the government and asked for a fasting mimicking diet. So can we generate food that causes the same changes first in mice and then in people than water only fasting causes? And so the fasting mimicking diet is a low calorie, low protein, low sugar, high good fats, let's say high unsaturated fat um, fasting mimicking diet, vegan.
So, have you done outside of cancer any research on the differences, and I'm sure you have, between water fasting versus this 5-day fasting mimicking diet? How does the body respond differently?
Yeah, we've done one study, and there is another one coming up, clinical one. But in one study with the IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, is interesting because the water only fasting, actually during the water only fasting, you actually saw an increase in gut leaking. So it's the water fast made the gut leakier. It didn't happen with the fasting making diet. And then after cycles of the water only fasting, we saw benefits, but a lot less benefits compared to the fasting making diet. And one of the speculations, I thought it's a good thing that I picked a very healthy diet. So I looked at, I call the longevity diet. I came up with something called the longevity diet, which is taken from the people that live long around the world, but also matching the science, et cetera, et cetera. So I took like an everyday set of ingredients and put it into the fasting mimicking diet, in addition to the fasting mimicking properties. And I think it was a good idea, because now we realize that those ingredients are feeding the microbiota, which are then helping modulate the inflammatory response and reduce the gut disease, let's say the autoimmune and inflammatory disease. Uh, Water only fasting did some of it, but much less. And so this is at least one of the first publications showing the superiority of the fasting making diet.
And when it comes to the fasting mimicking diet, this is a kit that you get that you and your team have come up with called ProLon. So it's a no-brainer for people that are interested in taking this on. You order this kit to your house, and it has everything you need to fuel your body for those 5 days.
Yeah, I have to stay away from associating myself with the kid. I am associated with it, but I donate. I don't take consulting from the company. I don't take salary. I don't, and all my shares will be donated to charity. And But yeah, so there is a company, and I'm very proud of the company, but usually I have to sort of wear my professor hat and not my founder hat. And so yeah, I just leave it at that. But of course, if you think about, sometimes I get criticism for this, but people don't realize that for this to make it into mainstream medicine, it has to be standardized, and it has to be standardized much more by the FDA now than we've done thus far. So thus far, we've taken it to a very good level of standardization. But soon enough, in the next few months, in fact, we're taking it to the next level, which is FDA standard, and that's much harder, right? So yeah, just to underline uh, how these are necessary steps to make sure that you can say yes, this is safe, and yes, and hopefully yes, this is effective against this particular condition, so that you have a true alternative or integration with standard of care.
And what are your thoughts about somebody taking the principles that you've used to put that kit together and try and go to the grocery store and fit within those parameters with ingredients and foods that they've brought in their home themselves?
I mean, I'm not here to uh, be the policeman and tell people what to do, but certainly I don't think it's a good idea, and it just very difficult to come up with the components of the kit. In some case, maybe a soup might have taken us 2 or 3 years of arguing and with people making the soups about, take this out, can you go lower, can you go lower, can you add this. So yeah, people don't see that, of course. If you look at a soup, it looks just like a good tasting soup, a reasonably good tasting soup. But yeah, so that's where the nutri technology comes in, and that's where every ingredient is studied for a specific purpose. And so when you put it together, it has to achieve lots of different goals. And obviously, you can't do that at home by just going to the grocery store. But again, people can do whatever they want. I would say it's probably good investment. Keep in mind the fasting mimicking diet is not about something that you do every 15 days. The fasting mimicking diet is something that maybe you do 3 times a year. If you're very, 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 very healthy, maybe twice a year. And some people might do 4 or 5 times a year. But it's something that is not done very often, and its job is to reset things, and put it back in a more functional state, into a more functional state.
And coming back to cancer and fasting, I'm curious, since there are these results now showing the benefit of shielding the healthy cells and making the cancer cells more vulnerable, plus a piece that we haven't talked about yet, which is helping with the symptoms as a patient is going through chemotherapy. I'm curious, are any conventional doctors at this point encouraging their patients to incorporate fasting as part of a chemotherapy protocol?
Yeah, of course, there are lots of conventional doctors and oncologists doing that, but they're a minority, right? So they're a small number compared to those that either don't want to have anything to do with it, or are against it. And yeah, so I always tell people it all depends where you at, right? So if you're stage one cancer patient and you're responding very well to the chemo, there is really no reason to think that you're going to have long-term side effects, long-term problems. And I would say probably stick with the standard of care. I mean, maybe I'll change my mind in a couple of years, but right now it's early to say everybody should be on the fasting making diet. But I say, somebody's stage three, stage four, suffering from the side effects of the chemo or other therapies, um, especially when the therapies are not working. That's when you have to go to the oncologist and say, I think that let's try the fasting making diet. So now it's been tested in clinical trial, in formal clinical trials, maybe on 300 or 400 patients, just the ones that are closer to what we do. But then there is another maybe 300 or 400 that have been tested in other forms of fasting, a couple of days, 4 days, 5 days. So it's been remarkable because I haven't seen a single case, a single study, and lots of these oncologists had nothing to do with us. I didn't see a single publication where the oncologist said, we saw the side effects caused, we believe it's caused by the fasting, and we think in this group of people, this should not be done. Of course, there was exclusion criteria. Most trials excluded people that were the BMI was very low, so they had low level of muscle and body mass. But in general, it's been thus far. It doesn't mean that continue to be having the stellar performance, but thus far there hasn't been any significant major side effects that are associated with the fasting mimicking, especially the fasting mimicking diet, but also generally water only fasting.
And for somebody that wants to, work with their doctor and incorporate fasting into their chemotherapy protocol, what does the timing look like with that? When do they start that fast? If they have a chemo appointment coming up. And I know you talk about in the book the importance of that 24-hour period after they do their chemo session, not going back to the regular diet. So talk about timing there and fasting and the importance of that.
Yeah, I would say we have a clinic, a foundation clinic, a nonprofit clinic in Los Angeles. I would say it's got dietitians and nutritionists and doctors that are associated with it. So it's Create Cures is the clinic, and I would encourage people to probably be followed. For people that cannot afford it, still you still followed. It's not necessary to pay. People that can afford it, of course, should pay and help the ones that cannot afford it. But yeah, so that's the best thing to do, create contact the Create Cures clinic and be followed. Why am I saying this? We have maybe 10 clinical trials running now on cancer, had discussions with hundreds of oncologists about many, many different protocols. And every time is a different protocol, is a different timing. So immunotherapy is going to be different time than radiotherapy. It's going to be different time than each single different type of chemotherapy, then kinase inhibitor, hormone therapy. So to say you should start this fasting mimicking, go home and cook it up, and it's borderline criminal for me, right? So yeah, I never done that. Luckily, I've never done that because then I started getting. I remember 5 years ago when I published my first book in Italy, I started getting calls from the doctor saying, "What are you doing?" And I was very clear, don't do this at home, but people still did it. And sure enough, they ended up in the emergency room. They ended up in bad shape because they were improvising. Each picked whatever it is that they understood. I give an example. I always say you should have, let's say, 40 grams. If you weigh 50 kilograms or 100 pounds, you should have 40 grams of proteins per day. How many journalists understood that you should have 40 grams of food that contains proteins per day, right? Journalists, not even subjects, I mean, regular people. So what does that mean? Now you have to divide by, that's a mistake, by tenfold, 4 to 10-fold, right there. Just misunderstanding a little detail like that, right? So of course I meant protein, like pure protein, how much protein you actually have from that food. But if you take the food, 40 grams of food, let's say 40 grams of chickpeas, they contain 4 grams of protein. So eventually you're going to become malnourished and you're going to think that I told you to do that. Yeah, so that there is probably 100 different things like this that regularly happen when people improvise.
I get it. You got to be careful. And earlier you talked about, hormonal therapy, intravenous vitamin C as being alternatives to chemotherapy. And I'm just curious, do you think there'll be a day in the near future where research will back up using these quote unquote alternative type therapies that, possibly have less side effects along with fasting, and they can produce similar or even better results than the current chemotherapy?
We're working very hard for that, right? So very expensive and very time consuming. But I think that again, people should go to their doctor right now and say, if things are not working, can I can we integrate this, right? So there is enough, especially in the United States, but all over the world, doctors have a compassionate use, right? So I even put it in my new book, which is hopefully gonna on cancer, when I come to the US in about a year. Compassionate use, the doctor can pretty much, if there is no other viable options, the doctor can say, I'm going to try something, almost anything, as long as it's scientifically valid. So he or she has to make a case why all of a sudden you want to introduce the fasting mimicking diet in these patients in addition to the standard of care. And yeah, so it'd be pretty straightforward. Why? It's like, well, there are 50 animal studies, there are 20 clinical trials. The patient is not responding to any therapy I'm giving them, or him or her. I want to try this. And yeah, so that's a clear compassionate use. I mean, somebody wants to argue with me, I'd love to hear. But yeah, so that's where the oncologist can say, I think you may be very much eligible for this use. And yeah, so vitamin C, of course, injectable. It's a little bit trickier, but certainly there are ways for the physician to look into compassionate use, right? So if the patient is suffering chemotherapy, KRAS mutated cancer, is it possible to get? I mean, the injectable vitamin C is available to physicians. With the compassionate use, they may be able to combine FMD and vitamin C and see how the patient responds. again, there shouldn't be anything that clearly is going to be better and it's going to work. It should be only in the situation where the oncologist feels they've run out of options.
Okay. Let's step away from cancer for a little bit at least and talk about the fasting mimicking diet. Using this protocol, like you mentioned, it's not something you're doing all the time. In the book, you mentioned for people that are healthy, they might want to do this 5-day protocol a couple times a year. So somebody's healthy, they're doing it a couple times a year. Take us through some of the physiological changes in a healthy person that's using this to, you know, extend their lifespan, promote health and well-being, and use it in a more preventative manner.
Yeah. So if you look at, of course, the molecular biology, etc., and the genetics, you can do mostly in mice and simple organisms, right? So if you look at a mouse, a normal mouse without disease, we know that multiple systems shrink during the fasting mimicking diet, and then they re-expand after the mice return to the normal feeding. And lots of these systems, during the process of starvation and refeeding, they get rid of damaged components, and some of it is autophagy, some of it is not. And then they turn on stem cells. And then during the refeeding, the stem cells now can give rise to new cells, and parts of systems and organs. So this process is probably, and we don't know for sure, but in the clinical trial now we see people that do 3 cycles, especially if they had high levels of these, cholesterol goes down, triglycerides go down, IGF-1 goes down, fasting glucose goes down, blood pressure is reduced, C-reactive protein, systemic inflammation is reduced. So so this is suggesting that maybe this, what we already know to be happening in mice, is happening in people. Of course, we're going to have to demonstrate it in people, but certainly we see that it works. We just don't know if it works in the same way in mice and people yet.
So we're going to get into the details of the longevity diet. This is the day-to-day diet that you recommend for people for maintaining health and wellness. A piece of that is having time restricted eating part of the daily protocol. And for this you recommend between 11 and 12 hours. There's been a lot of guests on the show, a lot of talk about intermittent fasting. And I guess in a way, the 11 or 12 hours might be considered, the lowest end of that intermittent fasting because a lot of people will eat within, an 8-hour window, a 6-hour window. So, what I want to hear from you is A, are you a fan personally and do you do intermittent fasting beyond that 11 or 12-hour window? And what are your thoughts in general? I'm sure, seeing this explode within the health and wellness space, people talking about intermittent fasting and all the different benefits, including weight loss and helping with inflammation. As you're seeing this all unfold and explode, what are you thinking?
I think some of it is good and some of it is bad, right? And and people just get excited about novel things, and our job is to make sure that even one person in 1,000 doesn't get hurt by it. So 12 hours of fasting, 12 hours of eating, um, seems to be very good, seems to come with benefits compared to eating for, let's say, 15 or 16 hours a day, like many Americans and Europeans do. As you go past that, you get lots of benefits, but then you start seeing studies indicating lots of problems, right? So gallstone formation, for example, it doubles between 10 hours and 18 hours. So people that fast for 18 hours have are twice as likely to suffer from gallstones. And also the people that skip breakfast, they tend to have a shorter lifespan and more diseases. And so um, people argue, oh, but people that skip breakfast maybe have bad habits. In most epidemiological studies adjust for that. But even if that was the case, then the question is, if you fast for 16 hours, and this includes skipping breakfast, why aren't you at least living normal, right? So why isn't that fasting, 16-hour fasting, um, counterbalance the whatever problem you may have, whatever bad habit you may have that is causing that you shouldn't do, right? Um, and so when you see a shorter lifespan, you have to wonder, yes, is it possible, like for the ketogenic diet, right? So ketogenic diet is in the same domain, lots of benefits, but then people that have a lifelong ketogenic diet, it's better based on epidemiological, a meta-analysis, not even just epidemiological studies. I mean, the studies of all studies, it's better to have 80% carbohydrate diet than have a low carb diet, if you look at all categories. And the best is about 60% of the calories coming from carbohydrate. So yeah, so then there's probably lots of benefits. And so, intermittent fasting of many kinds probably has a usefulness if it's done for a brief period, let's say 1 or 2 months. You do that because you want to go from A to B, and then you go back uh, to the 12 hours, let's say, the type of fasting that is not associated with any problems. Yeah, so I think that's always been my recommendation. I always look for things including the periodic fasting making. This is why I say do it twice a year. I mean, I love to say do it once a month, but I don't, right? So I say do 2-3 times a year, because it's just hard for us to imagine how that is going to cause problems in anyone. um, but it may not cause problems even if you go much more, but we want to take it one step at a time, and then maybe increase the recommendation.
The base of your longevity diet is a pescatarian diet, so people eating vegan, say 4 or 5 days a week, and then including fish 2 or 3 times a week. I'm curious, how long have you been eating this way, and how did research support eating this way?
Yeah, so in my first book, the longevity diet. So the longevity diet is not just a pescatarian diet. I mean, the longevity diet is really about a nutrition recommendation that are lifelong, and which include the 12 hours of fasting, for example, which include the fasting mimicking diet. But but the rest of it came from what I call 5 pillars of longevity. So I always thought, if you go into the courtroom, if you're trying to convict somebody of murder, you can't just say, "Well, I think this person was around the murder scene, so it must be her or him." You have to have the DNA, you have to have the motive, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's many pillars, right? Pillars of conviction, or leading to conviction. And so I think it should be the same in what we do, right? So lots of the times, some experts, they just focus on epidemiological studies, and epidemiological studies are great. So what happened to 100,000 people that eat this way versus 100,000 people that eat that way? But they're limited, right? You could turn things around, you can pick the right population, subgroups, et cetera, and get lots of different answers based on how you analyze the data, or how you pick the group. So then you have the epidemiology, clinical trials, you have the basic research, what makes a mouse live longer. And then you have the centenarians. What is common about all these centenarians? They were able to survive for 100 years, right? So they couldn't possibly do something so bad. Maybe they're not all doing great things, but they're not doing anything bad enough to do damage, right? So let's say, if they're genetically predisposed to go a long way, if they're eating bad food all day, they're not going to make it very far, right? So those are the pillars that I picked to come up with the longevity diet. And the longevity diet's got a lot of things that, for example, low protein up to age 65, mostly vegan, some fish proteins. Then from 65, 70 on, you increase it progressively, making sure lean body mass is not lost, making sure the immune system is not compromised. You make it more of a variety. You go more towards a Mediterranean diet from the longevity diet, as you get in the 70s and 80s. But that also is patient specific. Somebody that has a cardiovascular disease and has coronary arteries that are clogged up, or carotid arteries that are clogged up, may have to use something very different from somebody that is cardiovascularly very healthy, even in their 70s and 80s.
So yeah, definitely a lot of nuances to the longevity diet. I was just picking at that one pescatarian piece and just wanted you to expand upon that. So what I'm hearing you say too is the basis for this longevity diet is taking, instead of cherry picking and say, picking a research paper, epidemiological study saying this or that, or picking just a specific clinical trial, you're taking and pieces from 5 different pillars, overlapping them, and seeing the commonalities between all that research.
Yeah, what's a common denominator, and what makes it all, puts everything into place, right? So you look for, so for example, when we in 2014 we published on the protein, and cancer and overall mortality, I was working with a graduate student, Morgan Levine, who's now at Yale, is a professor at Yale, and I say, Morgan, um, I bet you my hypothesis is that people in America that have lots of proteins are going to have lots of cancer, and mortality, early mortality, right? And so she comes back and say that's not true, and that's what I mean when I say fall into place. It's not possible. How can it be? We have all these pillars supporting that, and now you give me just this ugly, answer. And but she had analyzed all ages, right? So she went from all ages, and I said, you know what? Go back and now split it into 65 and younger, or something like that, and 65 and old. And she comes back and she's like, you won't believe what just happened. Now, the people that are 40, 50, 60, and are eating more than 20% of calories from protein have a fourfold increased risk of dying of cancer compared to those that are in 10% or below. But this turns around in the 65, in the 70, 80, 90-year olds. They seem to have, if they have a low protein, if they report having a low protein intake, they seem to be doing worse or much worse. And then, we did some of the analysis of the blood. And in fact, the IGF-1, the insulin-like growth factor, goes down with aging. And so protein make a big difference. I mean, it's a long technical story, but I say protein make a big difference in this growth factor. So people that had a high level of it, had a protein, had a high level of IGF-1, and people that they had a low level of IGF-1 were eating less protein. But in the 66 and older group, it didn't make any difference, right? So that means that this growth factor was already so low that by eating low protein, you may clearly or probably making things worse. So this is the type of fall into place. So we're looking for things that kind of like, in the courtroom, at a certain point, you have enough evidence and you're thinking, there is no way that this person is not guilty, right? So this is where the jury says, okay, in 1 hour they make a decision, guilty, right? That's where you want to get to. It's like, it's just too many, from too many sides I keep getting the same answer. So whether it's a mouse, or it's a molecular mechanisms, or it's the epidemiology, or it's the centenarians, I keep getting the same answer. Don't have too much proteins when you are in the, say, 65, 70 and below group.
I see what you're saying there. And Walter, you've been in this health and wellness space for so many years, and I'm sure you've seen so many different superfoods come and go, in popularity. Things like kale and turmeric and chia seeds. It almost seems like every year or so there's a new popular superfood. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. And do you feel like there's these certain foods that are often from different exotic parts of the world, and now that, globalization, and we can get, anything almost anywhere, or at least over here in the West, do these quote unquote superfoods have any value to you?
No, they have value for specific needs, right? So there are potentially some foods that can take care of a problem, they have drug-like effects, right? So in that case, you'll have to know enough about that particular food and how the patient responds. But in general, I say stick with among the what's been described by the longevity diet and all these vegan, pescatarian ingredients. Stick with the ones that your grandparents and great grandparents used to consume, right? So if it's from the land of your parents and grandparents and that was commonly consumed, is likely to not be a problem for you. Now, quinoa is something that comes from a little town or area of South America, and it doesn't belong in most of our grandparents and great grandparents. Yeah, it might have certain features but risky, right? Risky, and the more of these ingredients you introduce into the diet, the more you're risking inflammations, potentially autoimmunities, intolerances, allergies, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we know, right? Because now we're, you know, there's so many intolerances and allergies that people have, particularly now because we're over prescribed antibiotics, we're over prescribed all kinds of medicines, and so now there is a lot of disruption of the microbiota. And now with the microbiota that used to at least shield and protect the gut from lots of things coming in and also process, right? And now you just received weeks of or a week of antibiotics. All of a sudden, that those friends, right, those microbial friends that this person had are gone, or they changed, and you don't know how to deal anymore with some of these ingredients coming in. Now, if they were part of your history, much less likely that they're going to be recognized as problematic.
As I was reading through your book, one
and
area.
and lactose is a good example, right? So
Go ahead.
no, I was saying lactose is a good example, right? So if your grandparents were from Norway, you're likely to be lactose tolerant. If your grandparents are from Sicily or Japan, you're very likely to be lactose intolerant as an adult. So just to give the most obvious example. So if you're Norwegian, you don't need to avoid milk. If you're a Japanese person, probably as an adult, you wanna think very carefully about including milk in your diet.
And what about gluten? As I was reading through your book, I was hoping you would touch on that topic and I didn't see anything about it. Are you a fan of gluten? Is it something you personally remove from your diet?
No, no, I don't remove gluten from my diet, but there are people that are gluten sensitive. And certainly there are people that are celiac, they have celiac disease, and so they have an autoimmunity that is gluten based. But I wouldn't be surprised if there is another range of people that are gluten sensitive. Maybe not, they don't develop an autoimmunity, but they develop sensitivity. So I think it's a good idea to determine, are you one of those or not? And of course, it's probably not a good idea to have lots of gluten, anyways. But to have some, pasta or bread or other ingredients that have gluten, for most people, it's probably fine. But if you do have things that bother you, then it's a good idea to go to a gastroenterologist and start looking for, is there an autoimmunity, or is there some obvious sensitivity to gluten. And then if that's the case, then for lots of people it might be a question of dosing it. You don't need to eliminate it, but maybe keep it very low. And but for some people, they may have to eliminate it.
Let's get into coffee and caffeine. And you do cite some research in your book about somebody suffering, if they're suffering from Alzheimer's, there's been some research showing that coffee could be beneficial in that specific case. So I'd love for you to talk more about in that nuanced case and in day to day. Is caffeine something you're advocate for or something you consume personally, or is it something you eliminate or keep to a minimum?
No, no, I love coffee. No intention of eliminating anything that I like until I'm pretty sure that is making my life shorter. And another one is alcohol, right? So, yeah, so coffee, a couple of cups a day. The great majority of studies are positive, whether it's cancer or Parkinson or Alzheimer's. Now, some studies are suggesting that, you know, for example, with Parkinson, as you get into the 4, 5, or more cups a day, you might have a protective effect. Now, I'm not advertising, I'm not telling people to eat 5 cups a day because then you can get in other trouble. But certainly, it's very interesting. And that's why I felt it was good in a desperate situation like Alzheimer's. And also we're running a clinical trial right now in Italy on this, right? So we have fasting mimicking diet plus caffeine plus mid chain fatty acid plus sort of ketogenic component of the diet. So we have lots of things that we give these patients because it's such a desperate, position. Once somebody's diagnosed with Alzheimer or dementia, the brain is really in bad shape. So you really need to try to hit it with anything you got. And you can't say, oh, 4 cups a day of coffee is necessarily going to be bad. I mean, it could be bad, right? So we're careful as we're proceeding with the clinical trial. So we're saying, start with two, and I forget now what the dose that we give them, but yeah, we tell them if it starts bothering you, then stop, right? So that's when it's good to have a good geriatrician, particularly in the very old, and a good doctor, just determining is this something that is too much for you and it's causing you some palpitation or other problems which don't no longer justify using it, even for somebody who may have dementia.
How do you feel about salt?
Salt is generally a good thing, right? Like sugar, is too much salt or too much sugar become a bad thing, right? So people forget that these are essential ingredients for us. And but yeah, I think that for people that suffer from high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, et cetera, then salt should be limited if it affects you in that way, right? So if somebody has a very low blood pressure, I would just talk to the cardiologist about, is it necessary to cut salt? And in some cases, the answer might be no. It's okay. You can have a higher level of salt because you're a person that is not negatively affected by a little bit higher salt levels. But yeah, in general, people eat too much sugar and too much salt, especially in the United States. So for the majority of people, now considering the 70% overweight and obesity prevalence in the US, yeah, for lots of people, probably cutting salt and cutting sugar and cutting starches is probably a good idea.
If somebody's following the longevity diet and that's their foundation for how they're eating day to day, is there any need for supplementation on top of that?
There is no need, but there is a recommendation of probably not a bad idea to take a multivitamin that has got vitamin D, etc., in it, and take a potentially omega-3 supplement, maybe every three. I always say every 3 or 4 days, just to make sure that you don't get into any severe deficiency situation, maybe because you're not eating a diet that has got enough variety.
And what are your thoughts on exercise and specifically when somebody is doing a fast? So, I guess talk about exercise in general, what type you recommend and how often. And then when it comes to during that for the healthy person, 1 or 2 times a year when they're fasting, how does that change?
Yeah, so exercise in the books I talk about 150 minutes a week. These are based on big studies. So 150 minutes a week of the exercise you prefer, and the exercise that you can keep doing for the rest of your life, or most of it, and the exercise that will not end up in hurting you in some way, right? So people have to be carefully and do 150 minutes. Then I add to it about an hour a day of walking, up the stairs, up the street. So yeah, so then it should be 150 minutes a week of exercise. Let's say bicycle or running or swimming, etc. And then about an hour a day of walking. Um, and that's probably a good idea. I always say pick two places, restaurant or a coffee shop that are 15 minutes away, and that's it. That's an hour walking. You go back 30 minutes each. And during the fasting making diet, there's no reason to exercise, right? And don't take a chance. If it's done 3 times a year, it's 15 days a year. No reason to combine. You could do probably on the first day because it's pretty high level of calories. I say 1,100 calories, unlikely to be negatively affected in the early times. But then you got 4 more days. Leave it alone. Rest. Use that opportunity to do other things. No need to feel. I say that whenever you feel you got to do something all the time, or you got to eat something all the time, then it's time to stop for a little bit, right? So if you feel like you got to exercise all the time, then you probably need 2 or 3 times a year of 5 day of non-exercise, right? So just to make sure it doesn't become an obsession. Yeah.
Earlier, you touched on the Mediterranean diet, and this is a diet that, at least in the last number of years, has had a lot of steam in the health and wellness space. I'm curious, when that's compared to the longevity diet, what are the biggest differences there?
Very big differences, right? I mean, the Mediterranean diet is permissive with almost anything, and the Mediterranean diet was never very clear about starches, about protein levels. So the devil is in the details. So, yeah, so no meat, no white meat, no red meat in the longevity diet. Low protein, mostly vegan, fish limited. 12 hours a day of eating. Yeah, it's really a completely different diet. And that doesn't mean it does not have lots of the components of the Mediterranean diet, but so does the Western diet have a lot of components of the Mediterranean diet, right? So all diets have similarities if you look hard enough. But I would say the longevity diet it's really about a program, a lifelong program that is person specific. Also, the Mediterranean diet is really about some limitations, but not very much, and allowing meat consumption that is much higher than the longevity diet, and also allowing generally there's all kinds of versions of the Mediterranean diet. But say the starches, the pasta, the bread, etc., etc. There's not a clear limitation of it, right? So that's another problem, and that's certainly a problem for lots of people that adopt the Mediterranean diet. They feel, well, it's a Mediterranean diet; it must be good for me. So let me just, for example, eat a big dish of pasta, which in the longevity diet say no way, forget that. That should be not part of that really fuels these ketogenic movements, I think, right? So that you go from the bread and pasta world to say, okay, now I stop it. I don't want any of it, right? So that's what lots of people do, and we instead talk about these old dishes which are maybe 70 grams of pasta, and now 400 or 500 grams of 15 ounces of vegetables and legumes, right? So that's an ideal dish, which is not necessary. I mean, which is contemplated by the Mediterranean diet, but it's not really at the center of the Mediterranean diet.
Walter, as we get to the end of the interview here, you've dedicated so much of your life into longevity and studying how we can extend that. I'm curious your thoughts on, if we were to remove all the external forces that were, or to our best of our ability, the external forces that are negatively impacting, how long we live and how healthy we are. and we started to, incorporate the right foods, the right exercise, what do you think it would be if we had to nail it down as a hypothesis, how long the human being could live?
I think we could have potentially an average lifespan of 110. Um, but I mean, average lifespan of 110 in the group that follows everything correctly, right? And follow everything correctly also means, as I talk in some of my books, which are mostly in Italian, um, also means having the right doctor, right? Having the right hospital, and we noticed, for example, some of the highest longevity in the world was in Monte Carlo, right? And then I went to Monte Carlo, talked to the Minister of Health, and they were saying, well, the ambulance will get to your house within 3 minutes, and we have a defibrillator, every block, and we have people that come and bring you food if you're over the age of 75 and you cannot afford that. I mean, yeah, so there's a whole system um, that needs to be implemented to make sure that you get there. And Carlo Bava, the doctor that followed Emma Morano, who I followed for about 5 years, but he followed her for 20 years, and it's really impressive. All the things that he did to make sure that she made it to 117 and the third oldest person who ever lived in the world. And so yeah, so that the to get to 110, I think as an average for a group, that group will have to be followed too by the right team, and I think that's the future, right? In the future, instead of lots of the money, instead of going to band-aid approaches, let's wait until somebody's got three diseases and give them 12 drugs. Let's put the money into the team that make sure you never get any disease, right? So we now have these little people in Ecuador, which we didn't talk about. They never get anything. I was telling some journalists the other day, we went down about a year ago, and there's one guy that is just a single growth hormone receptor genetic mutation, right? And this one guy has been drunk essentially every single day of his life. He's probably close to 80, and he still has never developed any disease, right? So what does that tell you? Of course, most people, or the great majority of people, are not born with a mutation, but it tells you that what we think is not really. I mean, things are not the way they seem. Let's say, right? So cancer is not really something that is unavoidable. Cardiovascular diseases are not unavoidable. Diabetes is not unavoidable. Alzheimer is not unavoidable, right? So that team, I think, it needs to be generated very soon, and that team can make a tremendous difference for everybody. But unfortunately, we put no effort into developing that team.
And when you look at somebody like that 80-year-old in Ecuador that you just talked about and the genetic mutation he has, how do you use that knowledge and what you learn from that to extrapolate to longevity for all of us?
Well, yeah, it's the very center of our pillars, right? So genetics of aging, whether it's yeast or mice or humans, we always look at the parallels, right? So this is why in 2003 I had written an article for Science magazine, and then Science magazine turned that and requested a number of other articles, turned into a whole issue on aging, and I called it evolutionary medicine from dwarf model system to healthy centenarians, question mark. This is almost 20 years ago, but the point was, the picture that the editor showed, so they took our picture and showed it in the beginning article of the issue, and they basically showed dwarf yeast, dwarf mice, dwarf flies, dwarf mice, and then eventually we added the little people of Ecuador. So yeah, this conservation is what I was telling you before about things falling into place. You get to a point and you're thinking, it just happens to be that this growth hormone is the main responder to proteins, right? So high protein, high growth hormone, high IGF-1, high insulin. So yeah, at a certain point, you get the sense that it's nearly impossible that this is a coincidence. And so yeah, this is just at the center of everything we do.
What I'm getting at there is the nuance of that specific example of that person in Ecuador, and it sounds like that relates to protein, its impact on I think you might have said a receptor there. So basically, you take that end result and try and figure out how through diet and lifestyle we can maybe mimic certain things to have certain expression of our genes, in line with what we're seeing in this population.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there's really, I made one example, but in my head and in the head of my team, we have hundreds of these examples and papers, sort of trying to make it all, use it all to then come up with something that is not likely to be wrong, right? And another example, for example, is the growth hormone receptor knockout mice that are calorie restricted, right? So you calorie restrict them and they don't live any longer. And so this is suggesting that calorie restriction and that genetic mutation are going through largely the same pathways, right? So yeah, these are just examples of what we use every day to make decisions about, is this really important? Our proteins, our sugar, what type of proteins, what type of sugar, are they really important, or is it just one study or 10 studies that seem to indicate this, but it's not really it, right? So lots of studies indicate that certain food can prevent cancer, but is it true? Because there are other studies saying no, it doesn't really matter what you do, you're still going to get the same level of cancers, and some of these studies come out of Harvard, right? So this is why to really make sense of it, you need to have hundreds and hundreds of these studies, many of which you need to have personally sort of done because they were missing, right? I mean, I went to Ecuador because that part was missing. We had the yeast and the flies and the mice, but we were missing the people. And so I look all over the world for what are the people that have this mutation, right? That are there any? And sure enough, there were 100 of them in South America and in Ecuador, and another 250 in Europe and the Middle East, right? So yeah, I think that's also very important to say that you're not going to always have everything in the literature. Some things you just got to go. I mean, I would say half of the things we had to go out there and do it ourselves because we're just completely missing in the literature. And that's how I think we completed the number of studies that were required to say, I'm pretty sure we're on the right track, and I'm pretty sure we can revolutionize the health span of an individual.
Well, Walter, this work you're doing is extremely important. I really enjoyed our conversation. We covered a ton. Other than listeners getting a copy of the longevity diet, how can they connect with you after the show?
Or if they want a Create Cures clinic in Santa Monica, California, so contact. You can look at createcures.org and then contact the personnel at the clinic. And if the problem is big enough, then I become involved and work with the team of doctors and nutritionists.
All right, Walter, we're going to link everything up over in the show notes. Keep up the great work. It's much needed. Thank you.
Well, thank you.